So when we left off, we were talking quite a bit about human development or child development and some things that can contribute to long-term effects. Specifically, we were talking about whether or not drugs are a good choice for children. Preschool children is the age that we're covering. We were then we got into a little bit about the socio cultural development of children. Specifically, we were talking about the second stage of Piaget's cognitive development. And then today, I want to get a little bit more in depth into sociocultural, which is Lev Vygotsky, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. But I do want to circle back around a little bit here. Let me share my screen with you. Going along how children learn. Again, at a young age, they, as Jean Piaget had described them as little scientists, little experimenters, right? They investigate the world and they're starting to learn more and more about it. One of the things I like to, I guess, one of the best analogies for kids is when they are developing their senses of the world, their experiences of the world, they start to really think about physics. They develop physics in their own way, they develop psychology in their own way, and they may not have really the terminology or the jargon or the working knowledge of what all these systems and theories are, but they develop their own, right? They know emotions, they start learning emotions. They start learning about gravity, right? They start learning about how the propagation of sunlight works. So anyway, all these things they start to develop on their own. And as time goes, they sharpen those skills. So that really holds true with their understanding of logic, of numbers and reasoning. And at a young age, they start to they start to count. I think I shared with you my story about my kids, about my son who had a slice of pizza, my daughter who had a slice also, but I had cut it up. But my son, without really knowing any formal math, he knew that she had more. She had more pieces than he did. So at a young age, even before they understand the concept of subtraction or addition or multiplication or division, they understand that things can be divided, that there are multiple pieces. And that's and preschoolers, as they start to sharpen those skills, they start to learn how to count in systematic and consistent ways. Okay. They may demonstrate sophisticated understanding of numbers, although they don't know necessarily what precision that comes in. Excuse me. Bad day for me. When we get into memory, which I've got I don't have a slide for it, but I'll kind of map this out as to how we have the concept of memory. They start to show signs of memorization. As far as, I mean, we know that they start to develop the idea that when something disappears, they go back and they look for it where they saw it last, right? Object permanence, according to Piaget. But they haven't really mastered the language yet, so it's very difficult for them to start to be able to recall things in terms of language. So we usually see right around 2-3 years old is when they really master the language, master grammar, and they're able to associate language with mental imagery, mental representation, right? So we call this the development of their autobiographical memory. And this starts to set in right around 3-4 years old. And I think I asked some of you a couple weeks ago, how many of you remember things before 3 or 4 years old? And I think it was right around that age that most of you were able to start recalling things, maybe dreams you had or experiences you had or whatever. And that's we really base that, it's based on language, because at that age, they're able to start assigning thoughts with feelings and emotions. And that's how we think. We think in terms of symbolism and emotions, not necessarily. It's not like a reel-to-reel tape or hard drive or anything. We don't have a sequence of ones and zeros going into our brain that are stored indefinitely. It is stored indefinitely, but not in those terms. So I'll talk about memory here in just a little bit. So anyway, they start to recall things at around the age of 3, and some memories they last throughout their entire life. Other memories they may not last for forever. And again, and that's when we start to see the development of emotions, or sharpen the skills of emotions. Okay. Information processing. Let me actually switch screens because I do want to kind of show how information processing works. Have we talked? We haven't talked about information processing yet, have we? I don't believe we have.
I don't think we have.
Okay.
No.
We talked about it a little bit.
Say again?
I don't remember.
Okay.
I know,
Yeah.
I read it.
I think in like in one of the earlier chapters, they went over it a little bit.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'll kind of map it out now. So there are different theories to let's see, why is this not working? There are different theories to how memory works. And again, these are just theories. We don't have any way to really put pins or receptors in our head to map these things out and show. Apologize here. Let me whiteboard to show what somebody's thinking. Okay. Oh, are you able to see that? Got a little line over here. So anyway, so what we have are concepts and principles that we really base a lot of our theories on.
Professor,
And
I think you're sharing the different page because it's blank.
is it white?
Yeah, it's totally white.
Okay, yep,
Yeah.
that's good. That's fine. Yeah, I haven't drawn anything yet. So anyway, one of the most popular theories that we use, and one that I like to use the most, is called the information. Information processing. Why is this not working well? I apologize. Information processing. So information processing theory, and if you know anything about computers, we've kind of developed this theory off of how we design computers. And I'll kind of share that analogy here with you in just a minute as we go through this. But essentially what the information processing theory says, that we have all this stuff coming from our environment. Okay, we have everything going on. Like, for example, if you walked into a classroom, there are certain, I mean, there are just many things, infinite amount of things that are going on in the classroom. You got birds chirping outside. You have a certain amount of tiles on the ceiling. You have a certain amount of bricks that are in the wall. You may even have 20 or 30 desks in there. But we're aware of all these things. And when we walk into a room, we see these things, but we don't necessarily count them or pay attention to them. All right. So we have all these stimuli that are just inundating us. And we go through kind of a buffer, if you will. So what the buffer is it determines what we are tuning into and not tuning into. Okay. And this takes the form of what we call echoic and iconic memory. So these types of memory are are things that come in through our senses that we may not necessarily be paying attention to, but they're going on in the background. So for example, maybe some of you have been to a restaurant or been to a grocery store or something, and somebody says something off your shoulder that maybe you're engaged in another conversation or whatever, but seconds later you say, oh, did I just hear somebody say something, or whatever. So that is an example of your echoic or iconic memory. It was when you say or when you hear or see something that you haven't necessarily paid attention to, but you go back a couple seconds later. It's kind of like rewinding the tape, just to say, oh, I think I heard this, and then you start to pay attention, which would be the next the next stage of this is selective attention. So selective attention happens when you choose to tune into something. Okay, you may have heard something, or many of you tuned in today and just kind of hit the record button on your brains. Now, similar to what I did with the Zoom call, you hit the record button on your brain so you can start to pay attention to what I'm saying. Some of you, most of you, hopefully. So anyway, the attention is your drowning out of all the distractions and trying to memorize what I'm saying. Okay, either you're writing it down or you're listening attentively or whatever. So this starts the process of rehearsal, working in putting something into short-term memory, or what also we call working memory. Okay. Now, these are very similar and they're very different, and I'll explain what I mean by this. So once you decide what is worth paying attention to, you're starting to commit that to your memory. You're working with those, you're creating these mental representations, these images, and you're starting to form concepts and prototypes within your brain. And that happens within your short-term memory. Now, your short-term memory is, if you don't rehearse and commit it to some form of memory in some way, your short-term memory only lasts about anywhere from 30 seconds to 3 minutes before associations are not formed and that information is gone forever. However, what we tend to do is, when we find something that's worth paying attention to, we rehearse it. Rehearse it over and over and over again. So some of you, for next week, you're going to be rehearsing the information on the practice quizzes. You're going to be taking them over and over and over again so that you can commit them and strengthen those associations so that you can do well on your midterm. Okay. So once we've rehearsed something over and over, or we start manipulating, which is, so short-term memory is the rehearsal, working memory is the manipulation. So that's really the difference. I mean, they're one and the same, but like, for example, if I asked you what 2 + 2 equals, you're able to mentally represent those in your head and say, and come up with an answer, which is 4, right? So that's working memory, is being able to manipulate images and manipulate information in your head to produce an answer of some sort. Okay. And that may come from pulling something from long-term memory, which is the next step. Okay. So once we rehearse it and it goes over and over and over again, and we have a good assessment of the information that we're learning, we put it into long-term memory. Okay.
Excuse me,
Yeah.
McMunn.
Yep.
So when it comes through the first time from attention into short-term memory / working memory, does it go first into short-term memory and then we rehearse it, and then it goes into working memory, or is it at the same time that it goes into short-term and working memory?
So according to the information processing, the short-term memory and the working memory are one and the same. Now, working memory is where you're kind of drawing off of long-term memory. So you're altering the information that goes in. So for example, if I gave you the practice exams and you're going to be taking those those items. You're going to be looking up those items. You're committing those to your short-term memory and then eventually long-term memory, depending on how much you retain that information. Now, that's not really, you're not really processing, you're not doing anything different with that information. You're just committing it to memory. Working memory would be where if I gave you, for example, who in this class can give me the days of the week, all 7 days of the week? Anybody want to try it?
Sunday,
can.
Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday.
Okay, good. Give them to me alphabetically. Crickets.
It would be Friday,
Okay.
Monday,
Sunday, Saturday.
Saturday, Sunday, Thursday, Tuesday.
Okay. All right. So that took a little bit more of a task, didn't it? Because when I asked you that question, you were able to access your long-term memory and spit out that answer relatively easily. But when I asked you, and that's how we remember the days of the week. Nobody really has a reason to remember it alphabetically. But when I asked you to recite it alphabetically, that was a bit more of a challenge. So you had to
Yeah, I
pull that in.
forgot the alphabet.
Yeah, because nobody ever asked that with the days of the week. So you had to pull that information from long-term memory, put it into your working memory, and alter that information so that you could produce a different answer. So does that kind of make sense as to the difference between short-term memory and long-term memory?
Yep.
Okay. So now, and I guarantee you, some of you are probably going to, after you're done with this call, you're going to recite this. It happens every class. I have students that want to try it again. So anyway, but that's the difference between long-term memory. I'm sorry, short-term memory and working memory. So once that information goes into long-term memory, it's there permanently. Now different when we're looking at are there any computer gurus in the class at all? Anybody that know how the working components of computers go? Like what would your short-term memory be an analogy for
That'd be RAM.
RAM.
yeah, your random access memory, right? So I'll change the colors here a little bit. So what about your input? What do we input into the computer? How does your computer get information from its environment?
Keyboard.
Keyboard, right? So yeah, this would be keyboard, mouse, scanner, whatever. Could be your camera or your microphone, right? All this information goes in, and based on what we want to use, that goes to the attention, that goes into our random access memory, and then our long-term memory would be our hard drive. Oops. Okay, so this is a great analogy, and this is kind of how we've based our theory of information processing. However, there are some big differences as to how we view things or how we remember things. So for example, our hard drive, many of you may have 500 gig, 1 terabyte or whatever. Your hard drive is very limited. Our brains are limitless. There's no rules on how much we can remember or how long we remember it. It could be indefinite. Okay. But we can remember just about anything we want to, if we rehearse it properly and we come up with good strategies for memorization. So the other big difference, so limitless is our brain. Okay. The other thing to remember that this is not not factual. Okay. So we don't remember facts. Now, what do I mean by that? We remember certain details, but we remember them in terms of how they make us feel. Okay. And feelings can conjure up many thoughts and many limitless information about how we feel about it. So we remember in terms of feeling, how we feel about whatever it is? What emotions does it evoke for us? And that can be proven throughout history, where we have one singular event that occurs and we have two people that explain what happened, and we can have two completely different accounts of that event, of that experience. So it really depends on how that person symbolizes it, how they feel about it, what their cultural backgrounds are. There are many things that can go into that. So anyway, that's like the big important thing. And I don't think we have any criminal justice majors in here, but that's a big deal. Why would memory be an issue for the justice system? What consequences could that bring in the justice system if we rely on memory?
Because it's like accurate. It can be accurate how you really remember it.
Right. Right. So if we have somebody that witnesses a crime, for example, and they talk to an investigator and give them their account of what happens, what they're really doing is they're telling the investigator how they felt about it. Okay. And I know that doesn't make a lot of sense. They're telling them what they remember, but they're trying to sort through their feelings and come up with facts about how they feel about it, or what happened in that moment. And that could be dangerous, because we could see, in fact, we've had thousands of people that were erroneously incarcerated because of eyewitness testimony. Okay, so our memory is not reliable. It's reliable for the person in terms of their survival and in terms of how they feel and how to either learn from that experience or avoid uncomfortable experiences. But they're a very individual, it's a very individualistic experience. It's not really.
That's so fascinating, because it does feel like fact for us. Like, I'm thinking of when I get in an argument with my husband, it's like his version, what he says, something that happened, and it's like, I think if it's like totally wrong, and that I'm remembering this factual way, but we're saying two different things. It's strange that it feels like fact, it feels like concrete, but it's really not.
Yeah. And there's a reason behind that. And I think I've shared this with this class before. We as humans are two things. What are we? Let's see if anybody remembers this. Maybe I haven't shared it with this class. I love doing this with my social psychology class and my general psychology class. But we as humans are lazy and we are prideful. Okay. And we see that in everything that we do. Now, lazy, I use the term lovingly, because we like to create routines. We like to put things into certain packages and generalize from them, because once we do that, once we set up these routines, we are able to free up our mental processing, or our mental energy, for other things, right? So for novel experiences. So in essence, we like to make things easy on ourselves, which is perfectly normal. It's a human condition. And the other part is prideful. We can't be wrong. If we are wrong, our world makes a lot less sense. So it's harder for us to admit that we're wrong, because again, we're trying to create these perfect little situations and categories, and put everything in their tight, nice, neat, tidy little packages, right? And when we can't do that, it doesn't make sense to us, and that's why some of these arguments happen. So, for example, for survival purposes, we want to feel comfortable in our environment, and we start to conjure up images, we start to conjure up theories and concepts that help us make us feel safe in our environment. So we may adopt things that may not make sense to other people. Okay. But our number one goal is safety and security. And if we don't feel that way, then there's something wrong. So that would explain why people develop feelings. Because feelings are tight little packages that they can put all their thoughts and facts into one little basket, and then kind of put it to the side until it's conjured up later. So in terms of memory, that's kind of what we do with memory. Is we take all these experiences, we package them up in what we call a feeling, and we put them on a shelf to use later. And then when we can pull them off, we can assign language to that and relay that to another person. So because the fact that we have feelings makes our account of what happened inaccurate. Okay. Because everybody has a different feeling about some things. All right. So that's really one other thing I do want to.
I do want to give example about iconic and iconic.
Okay.
The last semester when I taking my general psychology class, my professor gave us an example because like his clients working with someone, and when she was shopping in the market, she started to scream and like put her all hats down like that, and like stayed like, I don't know, like 1 hour with no reason.
Okay.
And she started to work with the psychologist, and they tried to find out why it happened, because it's not normal for her.
Okay.
And they recognized that when she was delivering her baby, in the condition, they weren't able to give her any anesthesia, and she needed to have C-section.
Okay.
So they directly take out the baby during that time, and there was a music playing at the background, the same music she heard in the market, and started to scream and they just figured it out, that is how it could happen. And I think it's so amazing. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know, it's just crazy.
Yeah. So she was triggered by something she wasn't even aware of.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's actually a very good sign of traumatic PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So people that encounter similar things like that, maybe I guess the most classic example is military personnel sent overseas, and they experience horrific events like their buddies getting slaughtered or something in a firefight, or going toe to toe with an enemy with gunfire or something like that. That could produce post-traumatic stress disorder, which means that they are triggered by certain events or certain things, and sometimes they're aware of them, sometimes they're not aware of them. Like 4th of July celebration. As a veteran, I don't have any issues with 4th of July, but there are veterans that are tortured by exploding rockets in the air. It's not a pleasant day for them. And it's kind of funny that we honor independence that way, when the veterans, the people that served, are probably negatively impacted by those noises and stuff. So anyway, but there are classics, and that sounds like a classic example of PTSD, where she feared, she went through some pretty painful processes with her birth, and that translated into traumatic experience, which was triggered by something else. Just out of curiosity, how did they wind up treating her for that issue?
I have no idea, but he told us that like my client is so smart.
Yeah.
I don't know how even they figured it out, but they figured it out after that. But I think it was so amazing. I just like, I kept in my mind because I wasn't expecting something like that.
Yeah. Well, what they probably did was talk about, trying to find what was one of the most traumatic experiences. And once we do that, we can work backwards to figure out what happened, and maybe even what those triggers might be. So if she brought up the song, and then it's kind of like mind investigating, and that's why I do what I do. I love investigating people's minds and helping them through this process.
Well, Professor, I don't take any psychology. I don't go any doctor, but I cannot sleep with the door closed.
Okay.
I have experience that is not good, but I cannot close the door because it happened after they closed the door. So
yeah. Okay.
I can.
Yeah. And we all have these little idiosyncrasies. We like things that make us feel safe, and that's an example of how we change our environment to make it safe. Now, things like leaving your door open at night, these aren't debilitating issues. These aren't things that are probably, I'm guessing, not interrupting your relationships, not interrupting whether you sleep enough to get to work the next day or get to class the next day. When they become a dysfunction, as we'll talk about a little bit later, as they become a dysfunction, that's when we start looking at disorders and treating them in some either behavioral or medicinally. So anyway, Yeah.
Can I, before you
ahead.
move on, can you just go real quickly again over how we turn memories into feelings, that part? Like you said that they're all stored as well, let me just, actually, is this what you said? Did you say that that the things that happen to us are put in long-term memory as feelings, like they're stored as feelings?
They're stored in symbols and feelings. We don't store things in terms of ones and zeros like we would with a video or audio or anything like that. We can remember them by how we feel about them. That might explain why you can remember the lyrics to one song and not another, because it's based on how you feel and how you relate to them. It's stuff that's already in there that you're drawing upon. So when we recall something, we're accessing how we felt about that and what it symbolized for us, as opposed to actually retrieving the ones and zeros like we would from a hard drive. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it does have, we can store language with it too. Great, because
Yeah.
like lyrics of a song. Okay.
Yeah,
thanks.
because those lyrics speak to us. When we talk about lyrics, we're talking about language, and language we also associate with symbols and feelings, right? So when we store something in feelings, in terms of feelings, those feelings contain a lot of thoughts and language and facts as we remember them, and that's when we're able to recite them or spit them out. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Okay, so in terms of memory, we have 3 stages that we look at. We have encoding, and we have, which happens from environment, from the stimuli that we receive our environment to produce these neuronic signals that go into memorization. Okay, so that's our next part, is storage. So storage is anything that we are either rehearsing or committing to long-term memory. And then we have recall or retrieval. Either one, they're really synonymous. But retrieval happens when we access that information from long-term memory and we put it into our working memory. Okay, and that's the function. That's really the difference between working memory and short-term memory. Is working memory can pull stuff either from your short-term memory to manipulate that information or rehearse it again, or it can pull information from your long-term memory and then start to either spit that out as a language or behavior or whatever we're using that for. So those are really the 3 stages of memory. Okay. All right. Any questions or thoughts on memory before we move on? Does this make sense? So we have different theories of memory. You have parallel distributed processing, which is it kind of goes along with Lev Vygotsky's theory of sociocultural development, which I'm going to talk about in just a bit. But in terms of just kind of thinking about how memory works, this is something that we use. It's probably one of the most popular theories that we use for information, or for describing how memory works. Okay.
I have a question, please.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I would like to ask, you mentioned that we can take from long-term memory to working memory.
Mm-hmm.
Can we also take from short-term memory to working memory?
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. And that's like if I what I just did, well, that's not true. Like if I gave you a list of words right now and asked you to recite them in a different order or alphabetically or chronologically or something, you're taking that information and you're recreating in your head, which is really a telltale sign of your working memory in its glory and its processing. Okay, so yeah. Now, what I did with the days of the week is everybody knows the days of the week. So you had to put them into your working memory to recite them to me. And also, when I asked you to do that in alphabetical order, you had to manipulate that information to rearrange it in something that you were unfamiliar with. So that's
Okay.
your working memory, is when you're recreating or reorganizing or prioritizing or something. Does that
Okay,
make
thank
sense?
you.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. It looks like, are you still seeing information processing on the screen? Okay. All right, there we go. All right. So let's talk about Lev Vygotsky. Oops. All right. So Lev Vygotsky was one of our major contributors to Vygotsky, how we develop our abilities and how we learn. Okay. And he called this sociocultural development. Now, we learned about Piaget, and we're going to continue to talk about Piaget as we go through childhood. But there are some limitations to Jean Piaget's model of cognitive development in that it really only pertains to children. So past adolescence, there's really not a lot of explanation by Jean Piaget as to how we learn and how we develop. So Lev Vygotsky kind of picked up where Jean Piaget left off. Okay, so the theory we're going to look at today is sociocultural development. So building upon the importance of social interaction, Vygotsky studied the role that social interaction plays on development. Okay. And development of their cognition as well. So he was really focused on social interaction between children, which were obviously growing. So he focused on children and their growth development. Excuse me. The interactions that they had with those around them, and also in the development of cognition and really their higher order of learning. Now, Vygotsky, unfortunately, he passed away at a very young age. He was only about 38 years old, and much of his theory was left unfinished. But from what we do know of what he did discover and what he theorized, it gives us a lot of insight into his theory of development. So we'll start off. So he theorized that social interactions really fueled learning or cognition. So Vygotsky developed his theory and said that babies had like these elementary mental functions, and they're really four of them. And I'm going to kind of write these down as elementary mental functions. I'm just going to put MF just to kind of shorten it there. So these elementary functions. So he said there were four of them, and one of them is attention. Kind of similar to what we looked at with the information processing model, right? What do we choose to put our attention on? So we have attention, and we also have sensation. How are they getting this information? What is their input? Sensation. Okay. And as babies, you remember they learn, according to even Jean Piaget, they learn by touching things, by feeling things, by putting things in their mouth, right? And then we also have perception. And this is kind of, Joe, going back to what you were talking about, how we develop our feelings about things is through perception. How do we perceive things? Because how I perceive what's going on outside of my house right now might be different than somebody else, like my neighbor is looking at the exact same event. They may feel annoyed by people walking by or something, right? So perception is really an internal process that we look at. And then we also have memory. How do we remember things? Okay. So now eventually through interaction with their environment, the sociocultural environment, these elementary mental functions are developed into more sophisticated and effective mental processes or really strategies. And this is what we call higher mental functioning. So they lend into a higher mental functioning, the more that we have exposure to these situations and that we develop our perceptions and feelings and whatnot. So that lends into what we call higher mental functioning. So much of our important learning that a child goes through occurs through the social interaction with a skillful tutor. Okay. And many of you probably have heard that word before, is a tutor. What do tutors do in terms of what you know?
Help you to learn.
Right. They help you to learn. We have them in schools, right? So it's a term that we're pretty familiar with. But Lev Vygotsky coined, he didn't coin the phrase tutor, but he conceptualized it in a way that that we have these teachers. They might be parents or somebody older. So this tutor acts as a model, and they model these behaviors or actions, and they provide verbal instructions for the child. So the child often tries to understand the actions or instructions that are provided by the tutor, and often the parent or the teacher might be that model. Okay, so they internalize it and they use that to actually guide and regulate their own performance. Okay, so let's kind of take a trip down memory lane and think about when you were a little kid and you were given your first puzzle to put together. I remember when I had my first puzzle and I was trying to solve it, and it was actually a Rubik's Cube. So my nerd moment for the day. But I was trying to solve it alone, and I had a really hard time doing it. But I remember my dad sitting next to me, because he's the one that bought it for me, and describing and demonstrating some basic techniques and theories on how to solve the Rubik's Cube. So he first told me how to turn certain pieces in certain directions in order to get a certain pattern. And once I learned that, I was able to kind of go out on my own and do it with other sides. So he taught me the first side of it, and then I was eventually able to go around the cube and do the same thing with all sides. And he gave me a couple other strategies as we went along. So eventually I became more competent, and my father didn't have to sit with me and show me how to do the other sides or how to solve the Rubik's Cube. And I was able to actually be able to do it more independent. So the higher mental functions are characterized by more independent learning and thinking. Okay. Which feeds back into which shows that the only way that we can really demonstrate that learning has occurred is by observing and understanding if that behavior either repeats itself, or if somebody avoids a certain situation because it's uncomfortable for them. Okay, so higher mental functioning is characterized by independent learning thinking, but that can only be cultivated by elementary mental functioning, which really involves a tutor or someone older that acts as a guide through which we model our behavior. Okay, so according to Vygotsky, this type of social interaction involves really a cooperative and collaborative dialogue. So there has to be a good understanding. There has to be a good relationship that the learner trusts that tutor. Okay, and many of you, if you have a tutor at Hack, for example, you develop that. You kind of think about that. You develop a relationship with that person so that you trust them. You trust that they know more than what you do, so that they can help you. And hopefully, sometimes that's not necessarily the case. Maybe you know more than what the tutor does, but I don't think Hack employs people or brings tutors on that don't know what they're doing. So that's really what promotes this cognitive ability or development. So in the example I was telling you about, my dad, he was what we would call an MKO, or a more knowledgeable person. or I'm sorry, more knowledgeable other. That'd be an MKP. So that's somebody that knows more than what we do. And so the first key term that I want you to know is so this is the MKO. Okay. So basically, the more knowledgeable other is somebody that is better understanding or a higher ability level than the learner, which is an example of my dad. He was more knowledgeable on the Rubik's Cube than I was, right? I was the learner. So the MKO has a higher level of understanding and the ability to, and the ability with respect to whatever the task is at hand. Now, that doesn't mean that you may have a tutor for a psychology class. That tutor may not be knowledgeable in math class. You may need a different tutor for that. So an MKO is really skill based if you think about that. Okay. So an MKO is someone else, but we have to add the social cultural factor. So the interaction of myself, which right here with my dad, who was the MKO, the other person was leading me to learn. All right. So this is me. Sorry about the terrible. Based on the MKO, the more knowledgeable person and the individual learning, we can determine that learning has occurred because I am doing this independently, right? I'm showing higher function because I'm repeating my action or I'm doing it without the help of the other person. That's how we know that learning has occurred. Now, the second key term I want you to learn is zone of proximal development. Or ZPD. Okay. But I'll just, yeah, excuse me. So it's called zone of proximal development. And basically, I'm going to illustrate in a second for you what this looks like. But the zone of proximal development is part of where the most sensitive instructions or guidance should be given. So in my Rubik's Cube example, I was in the zone of proximal development because I was sensitive to the information my father was giving me. I was between the ability of being able to do something and not being able to do something, which is really, really important, especially when we talk about teaching kids that they may have no concepts whatsoever. So giving them exposure to some of these concepts a little earlier on is really important because at least they're able to be curious as to what you're doing. So that's really the key guidance here with zone of proximal development is having basic skills to either understand what's happening or being able to almost mimic it with the assistance of somebody else. Okay, and that's what it allowed me to do is transition from the set of skills I already had to a more expanded set of skills by learning and going really above and beyond what I had already known. So this is really what develops these higher mental functions. So let's pretend that I'm going to draw, let's see, use a different color here. Let's use green. Green is a forest green, makes me happy. I don't know why. Having a Bob Ross moment right now. Happy little boxes. All right, sorry. I don't know if anybody knows who Bob Ross is. All right. Anyway, so what we have in this picture or in this box here are what we can do. Okay. These are our basic skill sets of what we can do. And out here, we have something that we can't do independently anyway. So I don't like to use the word can't, but for this purpose, we can say that without my dad's interactions, I could not have learned how to do that. So we'll put can't do all the way over here outside this circle. So this circle here represents everything that we do currently in our current state. It's again, we're doing independently. And according to Vygotsky, the zone of proximal development is really the link between the two. So right here is our ZPD. And learning, we'll put moving towards that direction of what we can do and can't do. Okay. So for example, I couldn't solve my Rubik's Cube by myself when I was little. So I would have taken a much longer time to do it over and over. Maybe I could have gotten to it. Maybe I couldn't. It really depends on my motivation to do that. But I was able to solve it following my interactions with my father. So the ZPD involves the interaction between with the learner and the MKO. And eventually I was able to develop the competence and the skill that I needed to do it repeatedly in the future independently. Okay. So this arrow right here, as I said, it's just going to show you, it represents learning and how our development. Now, another important aspect of Vygotsky theory in the importance of language. For example, a lot of you had to have a prerequisite in order to get into this class. Why is that? Why would you need a prerequisite?
That's in general psychology.
Yeah. Yeah. Why would you need general psychology in order to get into other psychology classes?
Because this one is more higher knowledge. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, this one has more higher knowledge. So you need to.
Language.
Yeah,
right?
language.
Yeah, you need to know some of the basic concepts in some of the language. Now, as I said before, many of us are keen to learning psychology on our own, right? Many of you probably know more about psychology than you really believe. But what we're doing is we're reinforcing that. We're able to assign a language to these concepts that you may have already known or learned throughout your life, right? So, for example, I mean, what does like somebody that's angry, what do they look like? What is somebody angry? What are some of the characteristics?
Frowning.
What's
Or like eyebrows like caved in. if they're
okay.
angry.
Okay. So physical features, you might see, their brows come down, right? You might see them tensed up. You might see their fist balled up. They might start shouting or cursing.
Body language. The
Dirty
body
language.
talk. Yes, the body talk more than the mouth.
Yeah, absolutely. But we didn't need to take a psychology class to learn what anger is, because we've already seen that. But what we can do with psychology is learn how to put those in terms of jargon, certain jargon or certain key terms, and then even how to deal with that in certain ways. So we may have encountered somebody that's angry, but until we go through a psychology course, or we have that modeled through some other avenue on how to deal with an angry person, that's kind of the example here of what we already know and what we can't or haven't been able to do up until this point. That's a ZPD. Okay. So language is very, very important. That's why we have prerequisites to some of these classes. So according to Vygotsky, he said that language is really the main means by which adults transmit information to children. And it's also a very powerful tool of intellectual adaptation. So he looked at private speech, for example. Private speech, we've talked about this before, the inside voice, right? That's the internal speech that people, we tend to talk out loud to ourselves sometimes. And that's a very normal thing, because that's what's going on in our mind. We're feeling a certain way about something, and the thoughts come out. We translate those into language, and sometimes that language comes out of our mouths. And it's when people talk out loud to themselves, which happens most likely to what type of populations, right? Children. Children are starting to learn how to internalize that outward speech and put it inside their brains. And it could be because it's not socially acceptable to walk around talking your thoughts out all the time, or whatever that may be. But most children engage in private speech. And Vygotsky sees this as a way for children to plan activities and strategies, and it really aids in their development. We see it when they're playing. They might have a dialogue between two little figurines or whatever that they're playing with, and that's their active private speech that's coming out. So talking out loud is their way of doing it. So he said that this language, therefore, is an accelerator for thinking and understanding. So children who engage in a large amount of private speech are actually much more socially competent than children who really don't use that speech that much. And Vygotsky believed that language develops from social interactions for communication purposes.
But
And
this is also the confidence. Is this the call? How much you repeat the action, you can feel more confident about it. So
yeah,
if you don't talk much, like you won't feel comfortable about it.
Right. Which and how can parents aid in helping children to develop that confidence and competence? What are your thoughts?
To offering an environment for them to
Okay.
like available environment so they can talk and feel comfortable about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So giving them the environment and not squelching that talking out loud. I see it all the time. Unfortunately, it's one of the sad truths of my job is I see some very sad cases where parents are annoyed by children talking out loud, and that could be a danger because if they're acting in their self-interest because they're annoyed by something, that doesn't really give that child, that squelches that child's ability to develop how they would normally develop, which could be problematic for learning later, or that confidence issue where they may not feel confident they can do something because they have a parent that does things for them all the time. So there is a fine line between promoting children to do things and promoting too much or promoting not enough. Now, there's also the opposite end of the spectrum. And I don't know how many of you feel this. So how many of you, I know a couple of you have children, but what do you feel about participation trophies? How do you feel about those?
What are those?
Oh, you've never heard of participation trophies? So essentially they have these like baseball teams or soccer teams where
Oh, yeah.
yeah, where you
Everybody
don't
gets a ribbon.
yeah, everybody wins. Everybody's a winner. What do you feel about that? Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I mean, it's a good thing for me. But my kids are usually the kids that are uncoordinated on the soccer field, just like running off and playing with flowers and stuff. So
Okay.
it's nice that they get, when they're very little. I don't know.
Okay. So probably not at a later age, you're saying. I'm hearing good thing when they're young.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else? What do you think about participation trophies or ribbons?
I don't know what to say, but
I think it depends on like the level of like if it's just for fun or like a school event, I'd agree to make everyone feel included and like appreciated. But like if we're talking like competitive like club teams that are like made specifically to go out and play against other club teams and like prove themselves, then participation trophies become unnecessary.
Okay. I like them. Yeah, excuse me. I think the concept of having everybody, because we don't want kids that are competitive really earlier on, right? Because that could foster a sense of inadequacy earlier on if they're not good enough or they're constantly being evaluated. So earlier on, when we're trying to build up that confidence and that competency level, I think participation trophies are a really great thing because it's getting them, it's rewarding them for being active. It's rewarding them for learning something and looking at what I drew here is what can they do? They can run around, they can pick flowers in the field while they're at a baseball game or soccer game or whatever, right? But we're promoting that activity and we're giving them the skills that they need to do.
Professor, they can be like my daughter. She play all the corners in soccer. She's sometimes goalie and she play the corner or the center. I say, no, you the goalie. And she play for everybody, so everybody have fun.
Okay. So she
we gotta meet your daughter, Jessie. Like
Oh yeah, she is. Well, she's in a
You
school.
gotta, she needs to make like a little visit to the class.
My
cameo
my
appearance.
youngest daughter is something else. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it sounds, so is she competitive? Does she have like a competitive personality?
Depend. Yes, she like to be compared, and she like to be best and everything. And I say sometimes that don't apply, and she try to balance. But when she's playing, and example, she saw the ball, and she say, "I can do it. I can do it. We can win. We can
Mhm.
win." So that's what she play and kick her and have her goals, and they win like 9 games.
Okay.
Unfortunately, she's not playing the last 2 years because she break the ankle,
Mhm.
and she cannot play anymore. And there's something in the knees that she fall
Oh,
and break it. Will have a lot of trouble, but she
yeah.
love it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's good. So she developed a passion for her abilities, and and that's what we hope for. We hope that kids find something that impassion them, so that they can go out and either excel in it or explore it more or something like that. Because once they do that independently, we don't need participation trophies when they get to middle school or high school, even, because they're already passionate about doing that. And then we start to see that competitiveness or that teamwork start to settle in. And these are all skills that are important later on in life. But back to the language ability, as we get older, that becomes more internalized. And unfortunately, some of us may talk like, if I get really, really tired, my inside thoughts come out. I will talk my way. I'll probably like read emails out loud just to kind of reinforce that. So many of you, I think, get emails from me at 12, 1 o'clock in the morning. If I'm responding to you, that's when I start to really externalize, because I'm getting so tired. But that internalized speech is called our inner speech, our inside voice. So basically, thought is the result of language, as I put on this chart here. The ability to think for ourselves and develop that independence of executing skills, it comes from the importance of language, according to Vygotsky, and that's learned socially. So there you have it. These are really the three main, well, let me label that 3. So language goes into thought. That's the third point that I want. But those are the 3 basics for Lev Vygotsky's theory. Any questions? Did this make sense? All right. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.